What's going on, guys? I'm CFBKings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Hope everyone is doing good. I got a great episode for us today. We're going to be taking a trip back in time to 2017 and focusing on a significant game in college football history that I think flies under the radar for most people in terms of its importance. So similar to episode 1, which I recommend watching if you haven't already, we're going to be playing the hypothetical game and asking what if. So let's get right into it. November 24th, 2017, Miami at Pitt. One of the bigger upsets over the past decade that I think most people probably forgot about. Number 2 Miami was riding high. They were undefeated, coming off a 41-8 beatdown of Notre Dame just a couple weeks before. The Canes went into Heinz Field on a Friday afternoon for the final game of the regular season. They were 10-0. It was the last week of the regular season, but they were only 10-0 since they had a game canceled, I think, ironically, because of a hurricane. But they had already clinched a spot in the ACC championship and had a spot in the college football playoff on their mind. But Pitt freshman quarterback Kenny Pickett had some other things planned, throwing for 193 yards and a touchdown while rushing for another, leading the Panthers to a 24-14 victory over the number 2 Canes. Going back to what I said at the beginning, we're going to be playing the what if game and taking a look back at a few different things that the results of this game had a major impact on and how things might look different had the game gone Miami's way. So first things first, the ACC championship game. What if Pitt hadn't upset Miami and the Canes had capped off their regular season at a perfect 11-0? Had Pitt not beat Miami, the ACC title game would have been number 1 Miami against number 2 Clemson. The top 3 going into rivalry week, the last week of the regular season, was number 1 Alabama, number 2 Miami, and number 3 Clemson. But Alabama lost 26-14 on the road at Auburn, so the Canes and Tigers likely would have just slid up a spot to 1-2. If Miami went into the ACC championship game undefeated as the number 1 team in the country, it's very likely that they would have been a lock for the CFP, even with a loss to Clemson, which is ultimately what happened in reality. Clemson beat Miami 38-3. But up until this past season, when Georgia lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game, a team that was ranked number 1 heading into conference title week had never dropped out of the top 4 and had always made the college football playoff, even with a loss. And last season was special with the number of contenders. We had unbeaten Michigan, unbeaten Washington, unbeaten Florida State. Then the scenario between Texas and Alabama, with Texas having the head-to-head over Alabama in Tuscaloosa. So you couldn't have SEC champion Alabama in without also putting Texas in front of them. So a lot had to take place in order for Georgia to drop from number 1 out of the top 4 and miss the playoff last year. In 2017, though, if Miami was number 1 and lost to Clemson, there wasn't really a whole lot of other contenders that were kind of waiting to take their place. In reality, Alabama, despite losing by double digits to Auburn in the last game that they played and not even making the SEC championship game that year, was given the 4th spot over number 5 Ohio State, who is 11-2 and the Big Ten champion. And that was mainly because one of the Buckeyes' 2 losses was by 31 points to Iowa, so it was kind of hard to make a case for them to be in. So outside the top 3, there wasn't really any major resumes or challengers for that 4th spot back in 2017. And not only would Miami's loss have come in a week of games that Alabama didn't even make it to in conference championship week, but the Canes also had a better resume than Alabama. Alabama had wins over number 17 LSU and number 23 Mississippi State, but Miami had wins over number 14 Notre Dame and number 22 Virginia Tech. And if Miami was 11-1, ACC runner-up, their only loss was to Clemson, who would have taken over as the number 1 team in the country in the final college football playoff rankings. The Canes would have had a serious claim to be in. And knowing the committee and how they never really set up rematches if given the opportunity, the top 4 likely would have been number 1 Clemson, number 2 Oklahoma, number 3 Miami, and number 4 Georgia, making the semifinals Clemson versus Georgia and Oklahoma versus Miami. Now that begs the question, if Alabama, the 2017 national champion, in reality missed the playoff and Miami was in instead, who would the new 2017 champion have been? And this gets to why the title of the episode asks if Pitt kept Georgia from winning a national championship, because with Alabama out of the way, I think the Dogs very well may have won the 2017 title. In reality, Georgia and Alabama went to overtime in the national championship game, where Tua Tagovailoa found Devontae Smith on 2nd and 26 for a 41-yard game-winning touchdown as the Tide walked it off 26-23. And even against Alabama, Georgia fans might tell you that there were some officiating errors made during the game that kept the Dogs from winning it in regulation. But if Alabama wasn't there to beat Georgia, would Clemson or Oklahoma or Miami have? because Oklahoma is kind of off the table because Georgia beat them in reality in the Rose Bowl semifinal, albeit in double overtime, a game in which Oklahoma led by, I think, as many as 17 points. But Georgia did come back and defeat them, and Clemson was beaten 24-6 by Alabama in their semifinal. But would the Tigers have matched up better against Georgia than they did against the Tide? But Alabama and Georgia were very similarly built that year, and maybe Clemson could have given Georgia more of a game than they gave Alabama. But I think in that season, the Dogs probably would have won. And then there's Miami. The Canes were very solid all year long. They had a couple close calls, but beat back-to-back ranked opponents in Virginia Tech and Notre Dame, both by multiple possessions. They beat their FCS opponent by 28. They beat Toledo by 22. They beat Duke by 25. Virginia by 16. They won at Florida State, won at North Carolina. Then in this scenario would have hypothetically had another road win at Pitt. And then they had a game canceled, I want to say, against Arkansas State. But then they would have had the loss to Clemson in the ACC Championship and would have been 12 or 11-1. Would the Canes have been able to challenge Georgia for the title? In reality, Miami's season was kind of derailed by that Pitt loss, as they lost to Clemson, and then in their bowl game to Big Ten runner-up Wisconsin, who finished 13-1 that year. But Miami slipped from 10-0 to 10-3 after losing to Pitt, Clemson, and Wisconsin. So had they not lost to Pitt and had the wind taken out of their sails, so to speak, could they have carried that momentum into the ACC title game, potentially putting up more of a fight against Clemson, and then who knows what they could have done in the playoff. If I had to pick one team, though, as the new 2017 champion, I'd probably say Georgia gets it done. That would have given the Dogs a third national championship over the last 7 seasons and would have given them 3 titles in 6 seasons in 2017, 2021, and 2022. How much would that have changed things around Athens? Do they pick up a few more notable recruits in the 2018 or 2019 recruiting cycles with that college football playoff trophy around for recruiting visits and stuff? Could they have landed enough additional talent to potentially compete for a 2020 national championship? In 2018, they lost in the SEC championship to Alabama. In 2019, they lost in the SEC championship to LSU. But in 2020, Georgia was 8-2 with their only losses at Alabama and in Jacksonville to Florida. And even with a number of COVID cases and opt-outs, Georgia was still able to beat number 8 Cincinnati in the Peach Bowl that year. So who knows if they had additional recruits come in, maybe a couple of transfers or something, what they could have done in 2020, and especially just over the last 7 years in general, had they had that title back in 2017. For argument's sake, let's say Georgia doesn't win the national title that year either. Maybe Clemson does match up better against the Dogs than they did against the Tide, or a few turnovers go their way or something, and the Tigers defeat the Dogs to advance to the national championship. This opens the door back up for Oklahoma, too, if Georgia is no longer in the picture. But what if Clemson had beaten either Oklahoma or Miami for a second time in the national title game that year? Had they won that title in 2017, the Tigers would have had 3 consecutive titles in 2016, 2017, and 2018, each with a different quarterback with Deshaun Watson, Kelly Bryant, and Trevor Lawrence. They would have made an appearance in the national championship game in 5 consecutive years in 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, had they beaten Georgia in this hypothetical semifinal for 2017. And how different are things around Clemson today if they had accomplished the historic feat of three-peating? Do things really even change significantly other than adding another trophy to the case? And what's the mood around the Clemson program today? Like I described earlier, if Miami hadn't lost to Pitt and the Canes were in the college football playoff instead of Alabama, and the rankings were number 1 Clemson, number 2 Oklahoma, number 3 Miami, and number 4 Georgia, no matter who eventually wins the national title that year, these rankings would have guaranteed that either Miami or Oklahoma would have had a spot in the 2017 national championship. It would have been Oklahoma's first national championship appearance since they lost to Florida in 2008, and Miami's first national championship appearance since they lost to Ohio State in 2002. If Oklahoma beat Miami and advanced to the national title game in Atlanta, what would the perception be around Lincoln Riley and the Sooners? The biggest knock on Oklahoma and Riley himself is that they were 0-3 in the college football playoff. Oklahoma as a program is 0-4 with the 2015 loss under Bob Stoops, but Riley was 0-3 as the Sooners head coach. Not only did they not win a national title with back-to-back Heisman winners, but they couldn't even win a semifinal game. If Riley started off in 2017, though, with the trip to the national championship game, how differently is he viewed as a head coach, and where does the Oklahoma program sit today? This can lead down the path of, does Oklahoma's fan base have a friendlier approach to Lincoln Riley, and does he stay in Norman? Does he never leave and go off to USC in 2022 if he has a college football playoff win and a national championship appearance with Oklahoma? If Riley never left and took the USC job, this likely means that 2022 Heisman winner and 2024 number 1 overall pick, Caleb Williams, never leaves Oklahoma either. What do the last couple of years look like for the Sooners if a guy like Williams is still there? If Oklahoma, representing the Big 12, won a CFP semifinal game in 2017, and the Big 12 had a team in the College Football Playoff National Championship game that year, does that change things with conference realignment? In July of 2021, Texas and Oklahoma announced their intention to leave the Big 12 and to join the SEC, and obviously money and the amount of it in which they could get was the most driving factor in that decision. But had the Big 12 had a team in the title game and potentially even won the national title in 2017, could the subsequent TV deals have been different for the conference? Up until Texas and Oklahoma's decision to announce that they wanted to leave the Big 12 and join the SEC, the conferences of teams in the national championship game were, in 2014, it was Big 10 versus Pac-12. In 2015, it was SEC versus ACC. 2016 was also SEC versus ACC. 2017 was Alabama and Georgia, SEC versus SEC. And then 2018 and 2019 were both SEC versus ACC again. And 2020 was SEC versus the Big 10. So, and the conferences that won those were 2014 was the Big 10, and then SEC, ACC, SEC, ACC, SEC, SEC after that. So, the Big 12 did not have a team make the national championship game up until TCU did in 2022, the year after Texas and Oklahoma had declared their intention to leave the conference. If the Big 12 was able to secure a larger TV deal after 2017 CFP semifinal win, a college football playoff national championship appearance, and maybe even a 2017 title, are they able to keep Texas and Oklahoma? And if they are, the Big 10 would have never had to match the SEC's movement and get the 4 Pac-12 schools in Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA. And maybe all of this realignment garbage never has to happen, but maybe not though. Maybe it doesn't change things that significantly, and Texas and Oklahoma are still displeased with their situation and try to leave anyway, but definitely something interesting that I was thinking about earlier. Then on the other side of that semifinal game between Oklahoma and Miami, what if the Canes had won and advanced to the national championship instead? Would the U have been back, so to speak? Could Miami have built off a 2017 national championship game appearance or potentially even a 2017 national title to get them back to where they had been in the 80s and 90s? And if the Canes had a 2017 national title appearance, does head coach Mark Richt still decide to retire after the 2018 season? He retired mainly, I think, because of some health problems and wanting to spend time with some family, but if he still did choose to do so, do the Canes still replace him with Manny Diaz? Or is there a coaching search outside the program that could have pulled a notable coach away from a different school? And depending on who they got as head coach and how the program was able to recruit and build off the 2017 season, where does Miami sit as a program today? And if Manny Diaz or whoever they hired as head coach instead is still there, where would Mario Cristobal be today? Does he stay at Oregon? And if so, where does Dan Lanning go? Is he still at Georgia? Does he take a different job somewhere else? Maybe with the Alabama opening, does that change things there? But there's just so many different coaching routes that we could also go down with this scenario with Miami and Richt and Diaz and Cristobal and Lanning and so many other coaches that could have potentially been involved. All of these hypothetical situations and potential timelines stem from one game at Heinz Field between Miami and Pitt on a Friday evening in 2017, and it's just insane to think about. And I like to do these because, obviously we can't go back and change anything that happened, but it puts things into perspective for me when I watch games and just noticing how significant each one can really be. And I don't believe in meaningless college football games. I don't believe in meaningless bowl games because they all mean something. And whether that meaning is obvious, like Pitt upsetting the number 2 team in the country and crushing some of their postseason hopes, but also the meaning of what that game could potentially do for other programs and subsequent seasons and the sport of college football as a whole. And I think it's cool to think about, especially as we approach another season here in a few months, that we really have no idea what we might be watching unfold during a game in terms of the ripple effects that the result of each one can have. Not only just for the 2024 season, but what we might see this fall could affect 2025, 26, 27, and it's just crazy to think about. To finish up, I wanted to point out a very unique relationship in college football that I don't think many people know about, if hardly anybody at all. and that's the relationship between Pitt and Georgia. And it's why I wanted to make the title for this episode the way that it is, with Pitt keeping Georgia from a national title, because the Panthers keeping the Dogs from winning a national title isn't just a 2017 thing. It's actually happened 3 times, and the other 2 more direct in their effect. But in addition to potentially keeping Georgia from the 2017 national title by knocking out Miami and allowing Nick Saban and Alabama in, who ultimately beat Georgia in the championship game, Pitt themselves also beat Georgia 27-3 in the 1976 Sugar Bowl. Pitt was 11-0 and number 1. Georgia was 10-1 and number 5, and there was no defined national championship game back then. So if the Dogs beat the number 1 team in the country in the bowl game and finished 11-1, they would have had a very legitimate claim to the 1976 national title. Then again in 1981, number 10 Pitt beat number 2 Georgia 24-20, again in the Sugar Bowl. This dropped Georgia from number 2 to number 6 in the final AP poll. And even if Georgia had beat Pitt, though, the 1981 title was likely still Clemson's, since the Tigers beat the Dogs in the regular season, and they were ranked number 1 in their bowl game before beating number 4 Nebraska, I think. But Pitt's victory over Georgia eliminated any chance the Dogs had at a claim to the 1981 title, because even if Nebraska had beaten Clemson later that night, the title could still have been split between Nebraska and Georgia, had Georgia beaten Pitt. But crazy stuff, though. 3 different seasons where Pittsburgh, of all teams, has either directly or indirectly / hypothetically kept Georgia from winning a national title. That's about all that I had for this episode. I really appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to let me know down in the comments if you like this sort of hypothetical what-if type content. Episode 1 is pretty similar based on certain plays in the 2016 and 2021 seasons and the potential ripple effects of those plays. But I felt like you guys seemed to like that one a decent amount, so figured I'd try again with episode 5. But yeah, really appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel on YouTube or wherever you're listening on podcast. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.